his master signified bodies back at it with another banger. Again, concept oriented, but we are still diving into seminar one of Jacques Lacan, uh, Freud's papers on technique. What's interesting about this one is I will do my best to kind of give a very thorough yet down to earth analysis between the difference of Freudian theory, psychoanalysis, and then Jungian theory of analytic psychology, and seeing what the hell Lacan has to say, trying to pretty much get into the woodworks of this and, in a sense, defend Freudian theory from, we could say, the charlatanism of Jung. Now, I'm not going to really dunk on Jung like that. I do like Jung a little bit, but there's a lot of stuff that I don't agree with, and you could see that with Lacan as well. But for the most part, what this video is going to go over with is not only the difference between Freud and Jung, what really marks the divergence between the two, because as you look in the history of analytic theory and psychology and psychoanalysis in general, Jung was a protege of Freud, but not only their own personal life, which caused a split between the two, but the theoretical split between Freud and Jung has to deal with libido. All right. But the last video we went over the formation of the eye and the mirror stage. This is something that's kind of unique to Jung, or to Lacan. Freudian slip right there. To Lacan, to help understand what the ego is and why we should get away from ego psychology, because the ego is not something that we need to heal. It is not something that we need to entertain, because it is trying to entertain itself and it will fail to do so. It's like its own very bad gesture. It's a bad joker, and we don't need to humor it. We don't need to baby it in the therapeutic session, in the analytic session, and the means to do so, in whether it's like through a countertransference or not, creates a stability of the ego, and then it's pretty much like it's trying to fulfill its own, narcissistic investment. So the difference between Freud and Jung when it comes to libido. One, on Freud's end, the libido is trying to clap cheeks. No, just kidding. It is sexual in nature. It is, and here's this misconception when we learn Freud in colleges or like senior year of high school in Psych 101. The whole, oral, anal, latent phallic stages of development have nothing to deal with childhood. They just happen to align during the development of child. We'll just use the term development loosely. What he's trying to get at is a development of libido, and that before we're going to be in a very Lacanian, Freudian manner of delving into this libido development. Before the mirror stage, there is just this symbiotic relationship between the child and its autoeroticism, meaning like it's just libido, it's just everywhere, it's just automatic, and the mother, and there is no one without the other. This libido dyad, because the mother fulfills the child's demands and overall libido demands of function, like child gets hungry, child gets fed, child shits its pants, pisses their diapers, whatever, the mother's there to fend. The mother keeps it warm when the child is, scared and cold at night. The mother is there to fulfill those demands. However, in the mirror stage, when there's this infatuation and lure by the gestalt, this perception which brings about a total image for the baby, and it gives a false mastery of the body, and we see the ego as this image of our body, but it's always fragmented. We can never get a total image of our entire body, but yet we have this feeling like, this is who I am, this is my body, etc. And with this whole lore, it's like with the animal kingdom, we see this image and seduction and lure of, let's say, the female animal making a dance in a mirage so that it can lure the male, so that there could be this primal mating for reproduction purposes for the species. Yet for Lacan's interpretation of this libido via Freud and applying the mirror stage, it's the fact that we are allured by our own image, our own misrecognition in this mirror stage, this I function, that now libido splits off into immediate demands to now the fact that it could see itself and thinks it knows itself. Now we have this narcissistic economy, this primary narcissism. And this economy is driven by libido, and it's trying to get a feel for itself. And then once we are immersed into language, then we have the castration, which means that now the Oedipal logic is put into our psyches, into our unconscious. So now we're structured by desire and its demands, and so now we want to project our ideal ego and this narcissistic economy driven by libido to produce this image not only for us, but also to wonder how we look in the eyes of the other. It's kind of like, think about it like Instagram. It's like this economy of selfies and images, but they have nothing on their own. Like, you could see like primary narcissism in its wish for satisfaction of its own position of mastery by taking the selfie, having all these different symbolic designer brands, commodities, and stuff like that. But really, it's not just ideal ego, but rather ego ideal as well involved in that, which is the secondary narcissism. And this comes from the likes that we get, the comments that we get from other people. They're dictated by what everybody else says about us, or what we feel we want everybody else to say about us. Our own caption on that selfie or whatever is part of our alignment with the primary narcissism, but really it's also we alienated ourselves for the other, and in this image of ego ideal, which is not just an image, it has this relationship with the superego. Anyway, the point being is that this is something that Lacan will say that has this force of eros that binds subjects together. In eros, not like in this metaphysical sense, but the fact that there is this function of love in a demand. You could see this in how relationships are, that there's a demand to be recognized. And it's the fact that we don't just recognize ourselves. We can't recognize ourselves because, again, it's a fractal image. So we need to project it out into the gaze of the other. And we want that demand of being known and being whole in somebody else's eyes, and have that response, have that affirmative statement, or even if it's a negative statement, like, you are ugly, or, if it's not you are beautiful or you are amazing, it's like you are ugly or you are worthless or you're not enough. These things still have a dialectical manner of propelling us forward and functioning in a certain way because we rely on that. Now, what makes this kind of an issue for Jung is that, well, in the theoretical sense and in the historical sense of the history of psychoanalysis, it's kind of redundant, but the point being is that for Freud, his criticisms, the criticisms towards him were that he only dealt with neurotic patients. He never really had any psychotic patients because he believed that they couldn't conduct transference like a neurotic would. That they had no coherent discourse. They were very incoherent when they spoke. They couldn't associate or lie on the couch and be in that position of just associating their fantasies, the whole 9 yards. However, Jung was more along the lines of not only dealing with psychoanalysis but also psychiatry in the same way that Lacan does. And so he definitely saw something unique in psychotics and schizophrenics. However, he saw that there was no aim of some sort of sexual object via the self. Rather, libido not being sexual, that there was this there was this struggle in the psychoses and the schizophrenia for libido, but what it was doing, it was splitting away from the sexual nature and trying to introvert itself for its own psychic development. He believed that libido was not in this narcissistic economy in the sense of Freud. However, I would argue that this is kind of more narcissistic. You could kind of see it in the kind of Zizeki and Althuserian critique of capitalism, and how we see the function of Jungian archetypes and this Joseph Campbell, woo-woo stuff. But libido wants to metamorphosize. It wants to transform itself, and it wants to integrate the unconscious into the ego, that which is conscious. Now, the difference of ego also is pretty unique between Freud and Jung, because Freud believed it was this development from the libido. Jung sees it as like a psychic fact, but there's also this level of transformation. Key thing, transformation and an end goal, a telos on the Jungian side, and then you have this economy, this cycle. And we should also keep in mind too that On Narcissism was an earlier essay in Freud's papers on technique, compared to his most iconic concept, which I believe Jung did not take up to par or really grasp for his theory, is death drive. The whole Beyond the Pleasure Principle essay, I do not think Jung really took that up to par and really grappled with it. I think he kind of just ignored it just because of his own biases on Freud. That's fine. This is what Lacan is doing. He's not only reconciling, but he's also trying to overcome a lot of the biases, the overall errors and blind alleys of ego psychology. And we could definitely see Jung being an ego psychologist because, like I said, he tried to see the ego as a fact, and that the unconscious, rather than it being rather than libido and being sexual, it was aimed at towards a transformation. So anything in the unconscious was trying to integrate itself into the ego through the analytic technique, that there was these shards that need to be retrieved, almost like some type of shamanic soul retrieval, to integrate into the ego and to make it more whole. Another thing that I find interesting in the difference between the Freudo-Lacanian theory in technique and the Jungian is the transference, which our whole leading up to now has been about transference and resistance. The great thing about Lacan was his structural linguistics, and he was showing that if you're going to have two bodies, you have to account for a third. Who is the subject in question? Who is speaking? What are these signifiers that are not personal, but rather the guiding law that situates the ego formation? And he points out too that Jung kind of confused the imaginary and the symbolic, because when we're talking about Jung, we know him for his archetypes, right? These religious symbols and motifs, these mythic structures. However, they're not actually situated in something like the symbolic in the way that Lacan is talking about. Rather, this is more imaginary because he even calls them imagos. Like, he's definitely like low key capping. Like he doesn't like to give credit to Platonism, but he's capping. He's a Platonist. We just say he's a Platonist. Um, he's kind of like in the same sense like Freud. It's like he doesn't want to give credit to a lot of the philosophers before him. However, he's got to give credit to where credit's due. They both do. They're both drawing from philosophy, and of course, we could see Lacan drawing from philosophy as well, especially in his early works. He's drawing from phenomenology. He's drawing from Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and all those thinkers in his time. You could see also like in the realm of intellectual thinkers, he's drawing from people like Bouquet, obviously structural linguistic thinkers like Saussure and Jacobson, maybe Barthes as well. I don't know, but Freud is like Spinoza, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and then for Jung, it's like you have Edward von Hartmann, a lot of romanticist thinkers and poets like Hölderlin, Goethe, and he was definitely influenced by Nietzsche a lot and Kierkegaard. But again, there's just like level where they just want to disavow these ideas because they want to be like, oh, no, we're trying to make it a science. And so I think this is like kind of where like Lacan is just like kind of like having to sit them down and they got to sit down and be humble. They got to be on their Kendrick Lamar shit. But again, Jung's theory of archetypes in a Lacanian critique are situated in the imaginary, especially how they are an integration of the ego. We know that the ego is produced by its own resistances and fantasies. So it's like this is perfect for people in the clinic, even today. Like, the fact that like, oh, you're working through your shadow and you have like an archetype, especially in your dreams, you like to, it seems like you're so drawn to the Christ figure, or you're drawn to like this Herculean thing, which it just seems like you're just trying to overcome. You're going in the underworld, and then you come back up. This could be something that is like pinnacle in your life right now. You're in the stage where you're just going into the chthonic realm. Like just all these things, they seem to align perfectly well with capitalist discourse and keeping people in their own phantasmatic realm and just reaffirming their own ego distortion rather than allowing them not to enjoy, which is something that Zizek kind of tells us too, that like psychoanalysis allows you not to enjoy. It says I would prefer not to, and this is what Lacan will later bring up with his theory of desire. I'm not sure if Lacan actually says this, like, the psychoanalysis allows you not to enjoy. This is like the whole Zizekian, like bringing Lacan to light and say like why he's important. At the same time, we're still going to use that. We are Zizekians. But yeah, this is like the critique of Jung is like he confuses the symbolic and the imaginary realm. He has no like theory of language, and it's surprising because he actually has this test of word association to affirm kind of like the free associative process, but he never takes language up to par. And he lived quite a long time too, so maybe it's just the fact that he lived in like Swiss Germany, and definitely probably didn't interact with the Parisian intellectuals like Lacan had the privilege of. But he definitely stayed away from a lot of the biological metaphors that Freud during his time was using. So again, the big criticism of Jung by Lacan was mainly the confusion of the symbolic and the imaginary, but also the fact that we need to go back to this, original reading of Freud and understand the narcissistic economy. Because it does seem like this notion of psychic interest or like this introversion of libido to work on itself is like very much narcissistic in itself. Like it's trying to go on through this transcendence of itself, but it's really no. Like that is just another part of fantasy, and I don't really think that Jung realized his own contradictions in his theory. But nevertheless, this is what's great about Lacan. He's working through. You know, he mentions Jung quite a bit in this seminar, and this is definitely one of these instances. So, libido is sexual. The whole ego is based upon a sexual lure, and this is what develops the primary narcissism. This economic investment, which is libidinal by nature, but it's investing on something that is lacking, but at the same time, this dialectic is driving it forward or sublating it. In this lack, this negative is this image that I function from the mirror stage, and then we have the secondary narcissism when language is introduced. Now, even in the psychotic, we could say that, and this is even something that D&G say, that, you know, we are full of intensities. Libido is intensified. There is this autoeroticism that Freud talks about. And in a sense, it's almost like schizophrenic or in psychosis. It's just this raw drive and experiences without some type of libidinal economy of an ego. But it's only when the ego is formulated, but not just that, the law of the father, the paternal metaphor, which neuroticizes us and fixates us. This whole paternal metaphor, Oedipus complex, whatever you want to call it, this is the overall structure that alienates us and makes us project outward into the other. We want to see, you know, the totality of ourselves in the eyes of the other, looking for this approval or disapproval, but yet they both this positive affirmation and then this negative, gaze of disapproval or due to the prohibition not being followed, like the thou shalt and thou shalt not, still moves the neurotic. And in the psychosis, which is something that Lacan will get into further in his Seminar 3, but we see something slightly different than introversion for some type of metamorphosis. Rather, it's just into this like extreme relation between the real and the imaginary, or the imaginary and the real. Somebody who he credits as Melanie Klein with showing that fantasy develops, through the child, and that there's this really confusion and intimacy between fantasy and this real, at least in Lacan's terms, the real, this incoherent reality. And in order to talk about it, it just symbolizes it, so therefore you can't really talk about the real. But anyhow, this is something that he will just take into par and really affirm Freudian theory for its discovery on, the function of the narcissism, the function of libido. And this is the whole point. It's about return to Freud. So understanding not only of the primary narcissism, but also the development in this principle of being castrated because you're cut off from the mother object of desire into the desire of the other and the commandment of the superego. This is something that I think Jung also doesn't take into account either, because again, he doesn't really see any libido development in an ego like the way it's being nuanced in Lacan in his rereading of Freud. We just see, again, like he says, like in his analytic psychology lectures, it's a psychic fact, and then he'll say this in the Ion, and then he'll say this in his works on the collection of the unconscious, or the collective unconscious. But again, he's definitely not he's not spitting the same bars like Lacan. Like Lacan is just on a sick one. He's got all his boys right there. He's got Hippolyte, Manoni, and just a bunch of these other French psychologists, psychiatrists, analysts, and they're just ciphering on it. They're just dropping that diss track on Jung. So, you know. Anyway, that's my short little thing on here. We are focusing on just pure concepts and breaking it down. And I got a good treasure for you. A friend of mine by the name of Nick, him and I are working through each seminar chapter, and then we are going to display it on YouTube. So that's why I want to focus on more just the concept and center around that, rather than what I was doing in the past and literally trying to go detail to detail on each seminar. And it kind of just makes it dry. But stay tuned for when we post up the stuff that literally goes into depth on the actual seminar chapter, line by line, and we have fun with it. Right here, just trying to have fun with just understanding the overall core concepts for each section and the focal point of it. And yeah, that's it. So hope you like it. If you have any comments, questions, concern, please drop it in the comment section. Like this video, and stay tuned for the next one. Enjoy your symptom, everybody.